Tonight on Primetime Politics, a new poll, a bigger lead for the Carney Liberals. New data from Liaison Strategies backs up other polls and says the Liberals are breaking away from the Poilievre Conservatives. So would it be wise for the Prime Minister to call a snap election? We'll speak to the head of Liaison Strategies. Also,
how can one person, one man, create so much turmoil around the world?
Now that America's top court has struck down Trump's so-called emergency tariffs, what should businesses in Canada expect? We'll speak to the armchair attorney for his take on what Trump might do next, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce about strategies companies on this side of the border are doing to react. Plus,
if Ukraine stops fighting back, Ukraine will cease to exist.
Marking 4 years since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine began. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but first an update on Canadians who are currently stuck in Mexico. Yesterday morning, Global Affairs advising Canadians in that country to shelter in place and to exercise a high degree of caution. This as gunmen associated with Mexico's most powerful criminal gang went on a rampage in cities across the country. Now that includes Puerto Vallarta, which is situated in the gang's home state of Jalisco. The violence, a direct response to the killing of the criminal cartel's chief by the Mexican military. Take a listen to what we heard from the Foreign Affairs Minister this afternoon, addressing Canadians in Mexico and their families and friends here at home.
In my conversation with Foreign Minister de la Fuente last evening, he indicated that the situation should stabilize in the coming days and that this was a targeted operation which will not continue.
Now, as you see on the screen, Canadians in Mexico are advised to register with Global Affairs. You can do that online, and there's also an emergency number you can call if you are in need of urgent consular assistance. Now, we'll continue to track the situation in Mexico and, of course, bring you any relevant updates. But for now, let's turn our attentions to Parliament with the Commons back to business this week after a significant break week in which we saw a floor crossing in former Conservative, now Liberal MP Matt Jenetter. His addition to the Liberal ranks did quiet some of the speculation around a possible snap election. But if the government were to call an early election, the polls say the Carney Liberals would do quite well. Take a look at the latest numbers. You're looking at the latest ones from Liaison Strategies just out today. And the Liberals, as you see, have a very clear lead here, a 12-point advantage over the Poilievre Conservatives. And to talk about this, we're now reaching out to David Valentin, Principal at Liaison Strategies. David, good to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, with that first set of numbers that we saw, that, of course, is the look across the country, the Liberal lead quite commanding. But how widespread is that support? When you go region by region, how wide is that support for the Carney Liberals?
It's a big lead in Atlantic Canada, a double-digit lead in Ontario, double digits in Quebec, a solid lead, about 8 points in British Columbia. Once again, we're seeing week after week after week where there is support for the Conservatives. It's all in the prairies. A lot of it is in Alberta. And of course, there's only so many seats that you can win out west based on the system we have today. And when we look at Alberta this week, a little bit of movement, not a lot, but that Conservative lead, which used to be a 21-point lead, is now down to 11 points. So we're even seeing some movement out there. Now, there's always going to be regional fluctuations. So we want to keep an eye on the trend. But so far, looking so good for the Carney Liberals. Okay, solid for them. And when it comes to leader impressions, talk to us about what you're finding there as well when it comes to Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney. Well, it's interesting because usually when we look at politicians, once their approval ratings go down, it's always a lot harder to get them back up. When we look at the long-term trend for Mr. Carney, he had some difficulty in the winter, but other than that, he's been in very solid positive territory and is regaining more approval. That speech in Davos, we can see on the trend line, really did have an effect. 63% approval today. So the honeymoon really is continuing for him. And for Mr. Poilievre, it's the inverse. It's the opposite. This week, we saw his favorability go down by 2 points for a net 4 loss. So a minus 17 net approval for Mr. Poilievre. It's really the numbers in the opposite direction for him. He was gaining, really improving his positives in January, and now we're seeing them start to slip all over again.
Mm-hmm. You know, what I find interesting is that you conducted the survey from February the 9th to the 21st, and that was essentially just after the Conservative convention where Mr. Poilievre secured more than 87% support of his party. But when you look at the poll, Poilievre is still trailing in leadership, and now his party, which was neck and neck into the winter, is now trailing the Liberals. What does that tell you about the challenge that still remains for the party? Because again, if you ask Conservatives in Calgary at that convention, they gave a very enthusiastic thumbs up to Pierre Poilievre.
Well, I think what's happened for the last while, whether it was the fall, the winter, or now the beginning of the year, is that Mr. Poilievre was really focused on that test of that leadership review. And so a lot of the policies, a lot of the things he was saying really seemed aimed and targeted at that conservative base, the people who might show up to that convention. And what we've been waiting for now is a pivot. Now that that review is over, is there going to be a strong pivot towards the general population, towards people who might vote conservative, used to vote conservative, but are supporting the Liberal Party today? And that pivot, if it is coming, hasn't happened quite yet, or maybe we haven't seen enough of it yet. I do think there was a moment, the tragedy in BC brought everyone together, and you could see for a brief glimpse, you know, a sort of a statesman Poilievre. But I think we are still waiting to sort of understand what would his approach to the president be. I know he says he can get a better deal. I think a lot of Canadians want more details than just slogans about that.
But in the meantime, we're seeing this very commanding lead amongst the Liberals. So again, to the speculation, to the debate as to whether it would be wise for this Liberal minority government to go to the polls, what would you say to that?
I would say that the numbers are good today, but listen, 36 days later, are they still going to have this large of a lead? I don't know. I'm unsure. Things happen during campaigns. They could nominate some candidates who have said controversial things. Maybe the vetting doesn't go quite correctly. The Prime Minister himself could make some unhelpful remarks. But as we learned from the last election campaign, you know, what happens down south really could have an impact. I think there's more risk for Mr. Poilievre in this one than there is Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney is going in high approvals. People like who he is. They've seen him for more than a year now, right? And they're not getting buyer's remorse just yet. Even though, if you look at some of the promises he made in the last election, they haven't really come true. We don't have a deal with the United States yet. There's a lot of things that are still left to be done. I think if he goes to the people and asks for a mandate, sure, it could go very well, but it could also go very badly if people think that you're doing an arrogant or opportunistic thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I have a quick 30 seconds here, so I'm hoping you can quickly turn your attention to Terrebonne, because of course the Supreme Court overturned the results in Terrebonne a week ago last Friday. The Carney Liberals do have this 15-point lead in Quebec right now. Does that tell you anything about where that riding may end up?
For me, I think it's going to be a toss-up. I think it's going to come down to voter turnout. I think Bloc Québécois voters will be very highly motivated to block Mr. Carney from a majority government, and it'll be up to the Liberals to find their voters and get them to the polls and convince them they can stop a general election.
Well, very interesting numbers today, David. Thank you for this. Again, good to meet you.
Thank you.
Well, as I noted, it was a busy week while Parliament was away, with the focus last Friday not so much here in Ottawa, but in Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Donald Trump's so-called IEEPA tariffs. Now, in Canada's case, those were the first round of tariffs applied on this country in response to a fentanyl crisis which Donald Trump accused Canada of fueling. But even with the IEEPA tariffs gone, Canadian officials are not celebrating in the streets, in part because other sectoral tariffs have hit this country harder, and no one takes for granted how chaotic and unpredictable the Trump White House can be.
Fortunate that we aren't affected as of right now, but things change on a daily basis, as everyone knows. President Trump could wake up and, you know, a couple options. We move forward and we get a deal, or he might blow up the Kuzma deal.
Well, to talk about last week's ruling on Trump's IEEPA tariffs is Matthew Leffler. Matthew is a lawyer and adjunct professor of law at Michigan State University, also the host of the Armchair Attorney podcast, which, Matthew, I listened to last Friday. Good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be here and talk about some of the most important lawsuits in America and probably the world.
Yeah, well, certainly in Canada's case, it affects this economy quite strongly, greatly. You know, the U.S. president, though, he was visibly upset by the tariff ruling that was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court last Friday. And I was listening to some of the commentary over the weekend with some commentators pointing out that tariffs have long been a cornerstone of Trump's economic beliefs, even before this second term. Talk to us about that. What do you know of that?
Well, we know exactly what's happened after the IEEPA tariffs were knocked down. Trump announced Section 122 tariffs initially at 10%, now at 15%. And those are going to be in place, I believe, for 150 days. There may be challenges to those, but the reality is President Trump has looked at the United States economy and said trade deficits is something he can't sustain. He wants to see some transition there, maybe to encourage domestic manufacturing, but ultimately tariffs are a tax paid by the importers, and that's something that trickles down eventually. And this particular use of IEEPA was something never done before. And finally, we have some clarity as of Friday about what the future looks like. But as you mentioned, make no mistake, there are going to be tariffs in the future, and they're tariffs now, and they're just not going to be under IEEPA.
Okay, so I'll pick up on that point in a second. But trade deficits, you outline as a prime motivator here for Donald Trump. But how much of this is just trying to collect revenues to pay down the national debt in the United States?
Well, the national debt is something that a lot of my generation and many of the people I work with think about pretty often. It's not something that we have a real solution to. Whether tariffs were ever going to be used to pay off the debt is something totally different, or whether it's going to have the deficit, another question that's kind of out there. Right now, all of this revenue has come in under IEEPA, and it's hundreds of billions of dollars. This may have to be returned to the importers that ended up bringing stuff in under that regime. So we're not seeing the end of this, and it's only going to accelerate over the weeks and months to come.
Now, you referenced the global tariffs, and those were bumped up to 15% by Saturday by the U.S. president. Again, temporary, 150 days, as I believe the quote here, before it actually has to be voted on, by Congress to extend it? How likely do you think that will be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have in America this three-legged stool. There's a judiciary, a legislative, and an executive. And the legislative branch, the one closest to the people, is the one that has the most power over raising revenue. And so when Congress decides to delegate their revenue-raising authority, there's a lot of steps in that process, a lot of things that kind of hamstring the executive. And that's by design. We want those things to happen. So yes, there's a finite duration for these new tariffs. There's a cap on how high they can be. But ultimately, as the Trump administration has shown us time and again, they fundamentally believe that the ability to use tariffs as a negotiating tactic is, essential to the executive branch. But at least with the IEEPA case, we have some guardrails in place with the existing tariff statutes, but there's no doubt more are to come.
Yeah, more are to come. Just how empowered is the president to do that, though, without Congress?
Yeah, I mean, he's got a lot of latitude. I mean, the emergency powers of the president are substantial. But what we have seen within Congress, both the House and the Senate, is some recalcitrance. Now they're starting to understand that maybe tariffs are not the most popular thing. We're going into an election year, obviously, so there will be some transitions. And tariffs domestically are not terribly popular with the broader percentage of Americans, though there are some who really do favor some form of tariffing regime, just not this massive general hammer that went on every single international trading partner.
Okay, so extrapolate here for me, because as I said off top, the IEEPA tariffs, at the end of the day, they only really apply to a minority of goods exported by this country to the United States. So the most damaging of the tariffs right now are the sectoral tariffs on key industries like steel and auto. Does Friday's ruling have any impact or set any kind of precedent on those sectoral tariffs, which Canadians are looking at very closely?
Yeah, there is none. I mean, the IEEPA tariff case has nothing to do about the amount of tariffs raised, the type of revenue generated. It all has to do with whether or not this particular statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, or IEEPA, fun to say, even more fun to explain, has never been used to raise revenue before. So that new use of this existing law is what the tariff case before SCOTUS was all about. So other tariffs that are in place, those have been litigated in the past. Those are certainly constitutional uses of the tariffing authority, though, again, maybe we still see litigation. But ultimately, nothing that happened on Friday has any impact on tariffs outside of the reciprocal tariffs that were first announced on Liberation Day a little over a year ago.
Okay. Matthew, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for this.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, let's pick up the conversation now with Matthew Holmes. He is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, also serves as Chief Public Policy Officer for the organization. Matthew, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
So listen, we just heard it, and I think it's fair to say that we were expecting it, that this Supreme Court ruling from the U.S. would not be the end of our tariff challenge. In fact, your organization says Canada, out of that ruling, should prepare for blunter instruments. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we mean by that is this certainly isn't the end. It's maybe a new chapter. The uncertainty is still there. It's very much front and center for businesses throughout Canada that they don't know where this goes next. But the responses, what are the mechanisms and the presidential authorities that will be used next to pursue this tariff agenda that the administration has? Those are hard to predict. And some of those could catch Canadian businesses in the crosshairs. And so by blunter instruments, we mean we will be exposed to unintended consequences or unanticipated events that could create costs and more disruption for Canadian business ahead.
So how does that make you feel then, knowing that talks right now on renegotiating CUSMA, reviewing CUSMA already happening, and by July they really kick into full force? How does it make you feel about those talks, knowing that this president is committed to tariffs?
Well, I think there's a strong signal out of the weekend, which is the clarification and the continuation of the exemptions that were under the old IEEPA tariffs, the 35% tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs that we all saw last year. But then they were clarified that anything that was CUSMA compliant could still come in tariff-free. And those were continued under this latest ruling under the 122 section. And so what that means is the US administration continues to allow CUSMA compliant products from Canada into the United States, except for certain sectors like steel, aluminum, auto parts, the ones we've been hearing the mantra of over the last few months. So those ones are impacted, but the general majority of our trade with the United States goes in tariff-free, and that's important to underscore here. The administration's signaling they are okay with the CUSMA deal. Obviously, there's some areas of ongoing negotiation and interest, but as far as signals go, that's a very, very important signal because it allows Canadian products to go in with one of the most competitive access points to the American market in the world.
So you're still hopeful that Canada will come out of this review happy with the deal?
I think there's still many miles ahead of that review phase. I don't believe personally that we'll have a deal struck in July. That's the renewal date, July 1st. I think we'll see this continue for some time. But for the time being, again, Canada has a very, very good deal compared to most other nations. You have to remember when we're talking about trade and tariffs, all trade is general, or all trade is based on what your competitors are also facing. So if the baseline is 15% and Canada's coming in at 0 or an effective rate of 5 or 6%, then we have a competitive advantage there, and that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so competitive advantage, foreseeable future, although that is not stopping Canadians, Canadian government, companies to pursue business elsewhere. And we just saw that last week in Mexico with the trade mission to the third amigo, if you will. Yeah. How important is Mexico? What is the potential of it, given the fact that in between, quite literally, geographically, is the United States?
Well, and I think that's really something to stand back and look at. The geography of North America, so much of our focus, both in the last year around tariffs and trade, but also over time, since 1994 when NAFTA first came into effect, we've really just focused on our direct neighbor, our Canada-US trade relationship. And then when we talk about it, sometimes we talk about the Mexico-US relationship. And the Canada-Mexico relationship, the trade has gone up 12-fold since 1994. So the trade agreement, NAFTA and then CUSMA, is working. It's creating far more trade, both at the service level and the goods level between our two countries. So Mexico is our number 3 trading partner. But if you actually look at the numbers, it's only about 3.6% of our trade, 1% of our exports. So the upside of deepening that relationship, of spending more time with Mexico at a trade relationship level is really important for diversification of Canadian trade. But it's also important because it begins to give us a stronger position around the Continental Trade Pact, the CUSMA, that we hope is reviewed and renewed as soon as possible. So it makes sense on multiple fronts to be cultivating and really deepening that relationship with Mexico and seeing how much can we grow that, because there's so much potential there. They have a really large and growing middle class. They're seen as an incredible manufacturing hub. Agriculturally, obviously, we have a lot of reliance and a lot of interest there. And then from a financial perspective, our banks and our financial sector serves that market as an entry point to Central and Latin America. So it's an incredible market for us. It's
an incredible market, but not just Mexico, because obviously the Canadian government is looking for trade relationships, building upon the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Asian countries, with Pacific countries, looking to build on things like CETA to be trading with Europe.
That's right.
But what support do Canadian businesses need from the government?
In terms of company needs, you've heard a lot of this message from the current government. Trade infrastructure. So if we want to get people and goods to market, and it's not necessarily to the US border, if we want to go east, west, and north, then we're going to need roads, rails, ports. We're going to need corridors of connectivity, the electrical grid. We're going to need those big projects that move people and products, digital, physical, and human, across the country to Tidewater, to our other trading nations. And that's a key piece. If we want to build the future economy, we have to start with what's at home.
Okay. Very quickly, Major Projects' office already up and running. Does that make you hopeful that the message is heard?
I think the message is there. Yes, we know we have a problem, though, in that projects don't get built fast enough here, and the Major Projects Office is meant to address that problem, but that's just the start.
Okay. Matthew, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, to the matter of Ukraine now, as tomorrow will mark a grim anniversary, 4 years to the day since Russia started its illegal invasion of the country. And in the intervening years, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that Ukraine has seen over 500,000 military casualties, and that includes an estimated 140,000 deaths, with hundreds of children killed and many others taken. Well, today, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress did hold a press conference with the Canadian-Ukraine Foundation. Take a listen to what was said about the war during that event.
Russia can end this war by stopping the invasion of Ukraine. If Ukraine stops fighting back, Ukraine will cease to exist. The bottom line is Russia can make that decision to stop the war. Everything else is just geopolitics.
Well, with more, we are now joined by Ihor Michalchyshyn, the CEO and the Executive Director of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. Ihor, thank you for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, as I said, tomorrow, a very grim anniversary, 4 years since this war began, since Russia staged its illegal invasion. You know, and on the one hand, Ukraine has been able to resist Russian forces and has not been overtaken. But on the other hand, this has come at a very heavy cost for Ukraine. There's no obvious end in sight. How do you approach this anniversary? Are you discouraged?
We are remembering those who've sacrificed with their lives and who have sacrificed their lives in Ukraine to flee, you know, the 8 to 12 million people who have fled the country and ended up here and around the world. We are, I think, rebuilding our energy levels in terms of helping Ukraine, you know, whether it's literally right now energy generators, what they need to get through the cold winter. People are seriously considering the recovery possibilities, the economic possibilities in terms of the defense industry. That's something very different than 4 years ago when there was a lot of panic and a lot of immediate humanitarian need to just get people fed and, you know, through the long days. So I think the community, it's a somber commemoration. I always say I don't want to be at the next anniversary commemoration. We shouldn't have a 5th year, a 6th year, a 7th year. But it is an important moment to mark because increasingly people are forgetting in general that this war is still happening. We get a lot of questions from people, is this war still on? Why is it still happening? Isn't it over? And of course we see the kind of international, you know, peace negotiations and air quotes that Putin is kind of manipulating in terms of a never-ending situation.
So do you have any hope for those talks? Because the latest round of talks just ended a few days ago. Do you have any hopes that will be the end of this war at some point?
I've never believed that Russia engages in any kind of peace negotiations or talks with any sincerity. They have their goals have remained the same since even before in 2021 and late 21 and early 22, when they were sort of putting all these demands out before they even had the invasion. Those demands haven't changed, and they're not facing any pressure from the Americans or anybody else about retrenching their demands. They want Ukrainian territory, they want political control, economic control, they want land that they don't even control now, that they haven't won through the invasion. So I don't believe Russia engages in negotiation in a fair way, or that anything will result in a just peace through that negotiation.
So how do you see an end coming about?
I see the end being Ukraine being able to destroy Russian forces that have invaded, and international pressure, particularly from the Americans, being overwhelming on the Russians to crush their economic and military campaign. We have to stop allowing people to buy Russian oil and gas, which fuels the war. Our humanitarian sanctions, while deep in scope and wide in scope, have not hindered anything, and frankly the Russians are importing soldiers and weapons from North Korea and Iran. So heavy international pressure led by the United States to actually pressure Russia to do something, and that will probably mean having these security guarantees of patrolling Ukrainian skies to shoot down any incoming Russian missiles and drones.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, and you referenced it earlier, we've had tens of thousands of Ukrainians settle in this country as refugees. You were, towards the end of last year, asking the federal government to create a pathway to permanent residency for these refugees. I'm wondering if you have had any response to that, and why you think it's important that that pathway is created.
So yeah, back 4 years ago now, people were fleeing, and the Canadian government created a temporary way to allow people to come to Canada immediately from Europe, where they had just literally fled with the clothes on their back and no idea of what was happening and for how long they would be away. We had about 300,000 come to Canada. Not sure at the time now of how many have stayed, how many have gone back, but 4 years in, people are settling, people are working, people are integrating into communities. Their children are growing up in Canada, and so the fair thing to do, we believe, is to stop treating them as temporary citizens here, and give them a pathway to permanent residency, to give them better options in terms of their education, economic situation, and general integration in Canada.
Any response from the government?
We have not. We've sent our letter to Minister Diab and the cabinet. We've had some conversations with her staff and the department, but we've not had a formal response from the minister, or have not had a meeting with the minister to discuss it further. We're watching every statement she gives carefully about sort of what signals they're giving. We know that there's obviously a new immigration plan, but we think the example we've given is a responsible and a realistic one.
Okay, listen, I need a quick answer on this one, but in addition to that, that's not your only ask of the government right now, because you are asking for matching donations from the government, because you've partnered up with the Canadian Ukraine Foundation.
Right.
Talk to us about what that money is going to go towards, why that money is needed.
So there's a project called the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, which has raised about over $100 million from individual Canadians since the beginning of the war, since 2022. That's a tremendous humanitarian effort, and so what the news conference today was about, marking this anniversary, talking about all the important work that's been happening, but also asking the government to support that work, to double our efforts. So if we've been able to put 50 generators in hospitals, can we put 100? If we've been able to feed, and I think their figure was something like 2 million people have gotten food boxes, can we redouble our efforts? Our belief is that community-based international development is very effective. It doesn't duplicate what's been happening from other international donors, and it has a track record of support from millions of Canadians, companies and individuals who believe in and understand what is happening in Ukraine is important for Canada.
Yeah, and to your point, the war is not over, and it's still very hard on the ground right now in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Listen, Ihor, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
And a quick note, we will have an interview with the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada tomorrow to mark the anniversary officially. Well, that is it for Primetime Politics on this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We're back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.